The story begins with a father looking at his little daughter and saying tenderly, "My favorite little apple pie." The daughter smiled, and the father continued, "You." The man seemed joyful and happy. He put his hand on her shoulder. "The first lady of this country." The girl was still very little then. The girl continued to smile happily, thinking about what a good first lady she would be. She threw herself into her father's arms and joyfully exclaimed, "Yes." The girl was sure that a good future awaited her. The girl's lips stretched into a smile. Her facial expression completely reflected her emotions. The girl looked at her father standing next to her. She continued, But her father had already passed away. Not believing this, the girl said in surprise, "No, father!" The young girl fell to her father's grave. It seemed as if a long time had passed since he had proclaimed her ruler. Remembering the guy's face, distorted with fear and incomprehension, she thought, "Wait a second, these memories, this face, this look." Her eyes filled with bitter tears. Her father would not see what she had become now, definitely. Now she was in a strange room, looking at which the girl assumed, "Is this the estate of Marquis Rinka?" Sitting in front of her father's grave, she thought doomedly, "It turns out that this body in front of me is my father, who died 15 years ago." A guy came up to the girl from behind. He looked quite familiar. He asked, finally came to her senses, "Reinhart Rinka." He continued, "You're annoying people with the way you cry like crazy. The crown princess can't be seen like that." Still in tears, the girl recognized the voice and turned around. Behind her, she saw someone she didn't want to see. It was the crown prince, Michel Alanquez. It was the same man to whom the girl was engaged, especially to the crown princess, with whom the marriage will soon be dissolved. Looking away, the girl asked coldly, "You just said it was terminated." He answered, "Yes, Reinhart, I'll say it officially." Bending down to the frozen girl, the guy continued, "I want to divorce you." The girl clenched her fists and became nervous. She did not understand why she was reacting this way. She looked at the man and continued, "Is this what you should say in front of my father's coffin?" The guy didn't answer and just smirked. He thought the girl was talking nonsense. The girl continued resignedly, "Michel Alanquez, my father died in the war instead of you." She remembered what happened 15 years ago. This memory just wouldn't leave her head. "This happened because of the order you gave. But how dare you? In front of him!" Their marriage was a marriage of convenience. It seemed that everyone around them knew and understood this. The dissolution of the marriage was a matter of time. Thus, the girl's father, the Marquis of Rinka, actually gave her the most important title in the Alanquez Empire. Thanks to her father, the little smiling girl, after her engagement at the age of 12, she became the crown princess and was called the wife of Michel Alanquez, who did not have any warm feelings for her at all. But of course, as is usually the case in marriages of convenience, there were no feelings between the crown prince and the crown princess. Sitting on the prince's lap, the girl said, "Stop importing salt from the Sarawak desert. Use the salt from our principality." The boy replied, "You're saying impudent things. In that case, there will be a riot in Sarawak." However, he still agreed. "Well, if that is your request, Dulnacea Canaria." It was the princess of the Principality of Canaria taken hostage. The girl had long blonde hair. He continued. Sarawak, dissatisfied with the recently concluded monopoly contract, revolted. The man's eyes widened. He tried to say something, but his thoughts wouldn't form into sentences. He said, "By order of His Majesty the Emperor, Your Highness the Crown Prince must personally deal with this." The guy asked in bewilderment, "Shouldn't a seasoned general go to such a place?" He looked down and ordered, "Call Marquis Rinka. He will lead the army in my place." The Marquis arrived and addressed the prince. "It is an honor that you have called the retired old man, Your Highness the Crown Prince." He continued to harp on about the upcoming battle. "I will go to fight, but I have a favor to ask." The fair-haired guy looked at his interlocutor with interest and asked, "Which one? Speak." Marquis Rinka replied, "For leading the army into battle. Put an end to the relationship with the Princess of Canaria." Thus, the father, who went to war for the sake of the girl, returned in a cold coffin. As he left the room, the boy said heartlessly, "Of course, Reinhart, I won't offend you with a reward for your father's death." He turned to her and continued, "We'll see, including monetary compensation." Tears froze in Reinhardt's eyes, but the boy continued, "Yes, 1,000,000 Alankers and the land of Helka. These lands were considered the most fertile territory. They were communal estates with endless possibilities." The girl thought, "As a deposed crown princess, I should be grateful for such rich and fertile lands." But she stretched her thin lips madly into a smile and said to the prince, "No, Life for life. The prince stared at the former princess in surprise. He looked at her as if the girl had completely lost her mind. The girl demanded, "Give me the life of Princess Canaria. In fact, my father died because of the princess's demand." She stared at the boy tensely and continued, "So my anger will dissipate if you chop off at least her hand." She was not going to accept it. The prince exclaimed, "So cruel and inhuman. If you do not agree, I will change the demands." She grabbed the guy by the shirt and demanded, "Give me your head, Michel Alanquez." The boy shouted angrily and incredulously, "Reinhart Rinke, what a lack of manners." He pushed the girl away with force, and she fell to the floor, hitting herself painfully. But not a drop of pain was reflected on her face. "Whenever you open your mouth, you only spout nonsense. I thought you lost your father, but it looks like you've also gone crazy." The girl didn't answer, continuing to lie on the floor. She didn't see any point in adding anything else to the conversation now. The girl stood up and the guy exclaimed, "That's it, we're done for today." He continued, "I will send an official confirmation of the divorce from the Imperial Palace in the near future." He finished his thought with insight. "You, who have gone mad, have no right to choose." Yes, Helka. For 15 years the girl continued to die in this land of possibilities. She kept begging, "Father, let me go back in time. Just one chance to kill Michel Alanquez." The girl pierced Michel Alanquez's leg with half of her sword when the man least expected it. His frightened gaze met the maddened gaze of Reinhart, who wanted to kill him. He screamed very loudly, so that the sound of his scream echoed throughout the area, causing everyone to turn around in fear. She prayed over and over again. She made up her mind over and over again. The girl remembered all those times she had called upon the Almighty. She thought that she could have a better life. "If I have the opportunity." The guy in the reflection screamed, confused by everything that was happening. "Cardinal." He grabbed my leg and ordered, "Grab her. She dared to hurt me. Reinhart Rinke." The girl exclaimed, "Don't name my estate," she thought. "I'll throw away my good name and properly go mad." She swung her arms and cried out in tears. This precious name was given to me by my father. Yes, she had managed to go back in time. Now this fact was for her that very second chance sent from above, at the time where she grieved 15 years ago. But now she already knew what would happen in the future. She had become the girl who would be abandoned by Michel today. But at the same time, her whole life was still ahead of her. Reinhold Delphine Rinke. Your attempt to assassinate the crown prince has been deemed an extremely serious crime. Sitting on her knees, she thought. So this is not a dream. The king continued. This title of crown princess is considered invalid. The king summed up the sentence vilely. Also, from this moment, the Rinke family is deprived of all its rights. The former princess thought, I went back in time, to the one who was overthrown 15 years ago. The king continued, the lands, property, and servants of the Marquis of Rinke shall pass into the possession of Michel Alanquez. She grinned darkly. Now he wouldn't be able to do the dancing he loved so much. Noticing her smirk, the prince stared at the girl in surprise. He didn't understand why she took it so calmly, but the former princess only began to smile wider, completely satisfied with her actions. Seeing this, the prince exclaimed, Reinhart Rinke, being such a daring criminal, dares. Father, stop the psychopath. However, the father only responded sternly. Because of the situation with Princess Canaria, the trust of the imperial family was already shaken. The whole country mourns after the death of Marquis Rinke. You announce a divorce. Be grateful that you stayed in your place. The girl continued to sit on her knees, and the king finished. Therefore, she is banished to Ruden of the Fielden family, she thought doomedly. So I am destined to die of cold. But then she smiled. Ruden belonged to his mother. It was a deserted and impoverished place, completely different from the lands of Helka, which the girl received in her past life. The former princess, clasped by two soldiers by the hands, thought, if this is not about wishes for me to die on the street, then what? The criminal expressed gratitude to His Majesty the Emperor, until her death and being born again and dying. Until the dragon flies over the Fram mountain range. In these lands where you have banished me, I will survive until the very end. I heard, rejoice in your crime, but she continued the thought, and I will curse Alanquez. As he made his way through the snowy lands, the man froze and exclaimed, I can't go on anymore. The girl turned around and said roughly, if you got your money, do your job. It had been a month and a half since they had climbed that snowy mountain. She continued angrily, you have fulfilled 2/3 of the contract. It is too late to terminate it. This man was a mercenary hired by Johanna, who was a maid. For her, who had to travel to Ruden alone. The girl thought that he somehow easily agreed to go with her, despite the long journey. She finally understood. "So that's what you were up to, you son of a bitch," and she said coldly. "Got it. Come back. Just a second. Hold on," he said. "We need to give money for travel expenses too." To which the girl froze in shock. He continued his demands. "Give me everything you have. I'm especially interested in that sword on your belt." The girl replied, "This is the sword of the Rinka family. If someone like you were to wear it, your head would roll." The man stepped closer and raised his sword above Reinhardt's neck. Before that, the noble former crown princess's head would fly off. The girl clenched her teeth in fear and reasoned logically. Survival is paramount. She threw the bags of coins to the man and continued. "How could I waste my father's hard-earned life?" Falling on the cold ground, she said, "These are all the things. Take them and get out." But the man didn't finish and said, "Wait, wait." To which the girl was again overcome with fear. She turned around in confusion and screamed furiously, "What?" The man replied, "Oh, I told you everything you have. I gave it to you." The man glanced greasily at the confused and dissatisfied former princess and replied, "No, there's more." Looking at the girl's body, hidden only by a dirty dress and a tattered jacket, the man concluded, "Looks expensive." Without taking his eyes off the girl, he said disgustingly, "It's a shame to let you go without even trying it." However, she turned around with a cold, steel-like gaze and only rudely ordered, "Disappear." The man clenched his teeth in anger, losing control over the words of the exiled princess. Unable to control himself, the man pounced on the girl and screamed furiously, "Fucking girl!" Having received a blow to the face, she, unable to stay on her feet, fell onto the wet and cold surface of the snow. Her eyes widened in horror and fear. Confronting a man on her own in such conditions was a difficult task. He fell on the snow and continued, "I wanted to try the girl who was the crown princess, but the denial is extreme." He grabbed the girl by the hair, who was resisting, to which she cried out in displeasure, "Let go, fucking hell." She grabbed the man's hand with force, leaving nail marks on it, and continued screaming, "Let go, I say." The man roughly pushed the girl away and barked, "Damn it. If you were calm, I would be gentle with you." Watching the frightened and defenseless girl, he said, "Whatever the case, the rods are necessary." Directing a shocked and frightened look at the man in front of her, she shouted furiously, "You will definitely regret this." He answered, "I will touch the exiled girl. Who will worry?" The girl thought, "No, just in such a place." Feeling a dull pain in the back of his head, the man froze in place and said stupidly. Then, uttering a lifeless and painful groan, he fell face down into the wet snow. The girl recoiled in surprise from the carcass sprawled on the floor and covered her mouth with her hand. She thought in a panic, "What? Why is he behaving like this?" While the man continued to groan, unable to get up. However, she quickly came to her senses. "This is not the time to think about it. Come to your senses, you can't miss such a chance." She jumped to her feet abruptly, realizing that this was her only chance to survive. Grabbing her sword, the girl confidently raised it over the stranger's chest and screamed angrily, "Die." Bending over the sword, she wheezed and thrust it harder into the dying man's chest. The girl pulled the sword out of the stranger's chest. The man's hand shook in death throes, and he uttered his last wheeze. Continuing to squeeze the base of the sword, she thought with relief, "She did it. She survived." Having lowered the sword onto the snow, the girl fell onto her hands and exclaimed with relief. A round, bloody fetus rolled out from behind the dead man's body. The girl picked it up from the floor in surprise and began to examine it. It is a fruit. There is blood on it. She wondered with fear. Had this fruit really just gotten into him? Turning to the bushes behind her, the former princess saw movement in the bushes. Someone was hiding there. The girl put her sword in front of her for protection and screamed loudly, "Who's there? If you don't want to die, come out now!" Finally noticing a man hiding in the bushes, the girl stared at him in bewilderment and thought. A child peeked out from behind the bushes. Wrapped in rags, he silently looked at the surprised princess. The boy tried to say something. The princess took him for a demonic beast. In confusion, looking at the child, the girl thought, "This is a person, and a small child at that. Why is he in such a place? Could it really have been a barbarian living on the northern ridge? No, that simply couldn't be." The girl remembered how she was told about this as a child. Her father told her about them. They make little children bait. In these thoughts, the girl raised her sword in front of her again for defense and thought, "Let's see if he attacks." I hold back the cold steel with shaking hands. She threatened menacingly, "Don't come near. If you come near, I'll cut you down." Hearing someone else's threat, the boy's eyes widened in fear. and he quickly moved towards the exiled princess standing nearby. In fear, she screamed, "I'm serious, don't come any closer. If you come any closer, I'll cut you down." However, the boy did not react to the girl's threats, and without slowing down, continued running. The girl clenched her teeth nervously. The tension caused a drop of sweat to run down her cheek. Then she screamed, "Damn it, I told you not to come near!" However, he, without hesitation, grabbed the sharp part of the blade with his palm, forcing her to stop. Reinhardt's eyes widened in horror as she realized the boy had grabbed her weapon with his bare hands. Having managed to stop the blade right above his head, the child continued to hold it with his palms through the pain. Grabbing her wrist to maintain control of the sword in her hand, the girl thought. Didn't even move. Continuing to ignore the sharp pain in his palm, the boy calmly lowered the bloody tip of the sword lower. Grasping the sword by the top of its blade with one hand, the boy grabbed the girl's hand. Opening his mouth, the child squeezed his hand harder and brought it to his mouth. The girl squeezed her eyes shut in fear, clenched her teeth even harder and thought, "No, he'll eat me." Feeling something strange, the girl opened her eyes in surprise and stared at the boy with incomprehension. Contrary to the girl's thoughts that he would want to eat her hand, the child began to carefully lick the stranger's fingers. The boy paid special attention to the place where she had been wounded between her fingers. The princess, pursing her lips, watched in shock as her fingers were licked by a little boy. A memory of killing a man flashed through her mind. It seemed I had cut myself in my haste to point the sword at him. The boy finished, and licking his lips, stepped back. The girl thought absent-mindedly, "I didn't even notice that I hurt myself." Looking at the innocent child, the former princess guessed. "Then he just did it to heal my wound." She pointed to the boy in the direction of the stolen fruit and asked, "This, you threw." The child hesitated, clasped his hands, and silently looked down at the floor. Noticing this, the girl understood. This child didn't mean to hurt me. And, starting to examine the hand, she said, "Thank you." The boy looked away from the snow and finally looked at the girl, but continued to remain silent. The girl assumed, he does not understand speech, but suddenly she noticed his wound. The girl knelt down in front of him and said again, this time syllable by syllable, "Thank you, really." However, he remained silent. Looking into her first aid kit, she said with annoyance, "Damn, everything is soaked in blood. The bentas can't be used anymore." Meanwhile, while the girl was rummaging through the first aid kit, a stuttering voice was suddenly heard from behind her. The girl turned around in confusion and thought, "Wait a second, he's about to say something." The child again looked at the floor in embarrassment and continued his attempts to pronounce the word, "Zva." And the girl thought, "Zvali." The memory of how she cursed as she fell into the snow after killing the mercenary came back to her mind. At that very moment, a boy appeared from behind the bushes. Does this child really consider a curse word to be his own name? After which the girl gently, with special care, touched the jet black hair. However, the boy recoiled in fear, covering his head with both hands. It seemed he had been abused while growing up. The boy hysterically covered his face with both hands and stuttered, "No." Noticing this reaction, the former princess firmly said, "I won't hit you." And at the same time she thought, "Poor thing." The boy, removing his palms from his face, moved them behind his ear in shock. Raising her palm closer again, Reinhart repeated confidently and gratefully, "Thank you." The boy's gaze still expressed only surprise. Drops of sweat ran down his cheeks, either from the cold or from excitement. However, the girl confidently repeated again, "Thank you." Gently lifting her hand to the top of his head again, she was finally able to look at the boy's hair. The girl walked away, and the boy stared in shock at his wounded arm, already bandaged. The girl stepped back, and looking at the map, began to speak. "By the way, if we don't start moving, the sun will set. Rudin is that way." Running in front of her, the boy spread his arms threateningly and shouted, "No!" The girl stopped and asked in confusion, "What?" However, the boy answered only one thing, "No." The horrible memories of her conversation with her father came back to her mind. Using a small child as bait, they eat people. The boy repeated nervously, stammering, "No, no." And leaving the girl, he quickly rushed off in an unknown direction, throwing it after her. No. However, exhaling, she quickly pulled herself away from these disturbing thoughts. She understood. This child cares about me. I will check and listen to him. To which the girl nervously called out to the boy who was running away, "Let's go together. I can't walk as fast as you." Coming closer and bending slightly towards the child blocking the way, she asked, "If not there, then in which direction?" Making our way along the snowy slopes and peaks in the direction indicated by the child for about 2 hours. She turned doubtfully to the child and thought, "We arrived much earlier than if we had followed the map." Having entered the nearest cave to spend the night, the girl gave the command, "It's already late at night, so we'll set out tomorrow." Making a fire with a platform of 2 small stones, she continued, "And it's snowing. You can't see anything ahead." Behind her sat a boy, looking confused. "I checked the road, so everything is fine. We can arrive in Rudin tomorrow." The boy's face was illuminated by the light and warmth from the fire the girl had made with stones. She got up from the floor and said with relief, "Phew, I barely got the fire going." The boy continued to stare at the stones in her hands, with the help of which she had managed to start a fire. Having got them for himself, he began to rub them together with great interest, creating sparks through friction. The girl moved away from the fire and asked with interest, cheerfully. However, the boy again said only one thing, "No." Noticing that he answered her every question with this word, the girl asked reasonably, "This is the only thing you can say." "No," she thought. "If I take him with me to Rudin, I'll have to teach him to talk first." And she continued to watch. A rather logical, static question arose in her thoughts again. Where did he come from here? And what did he do? A large, snow-covered city appeared before their eyes. Closed by high walls, it had 2 sections, residential and government. The girl and the boy were met at the entrance by the guards assigned to the gate. A strange, loud sound was heard behind them, and the guards turned around in confusion. The child, held in the former princess's strong grip, screamed and struggled. "Yeah," while she was asking, "Calm down," the girl said tenderly. "Even without knowing what you do, I understand that you don't have a normal guardian." However, the boy did not obey. He continued to kick in someone else's hands and scream. "Damn, I can't hold him by force," she thought. "How can I calm him down?" And she nervously looked around the vicinity, searching for something that could help. From behind the guards, a city dweller appeared, asking worriedly, "What's all the noise?" Seeing that he was carrying bread, she understood. Yes, if it was about food. And she quickly ran up to the local. "Listen, sell me 2 loaves." Having bought the bread, the girl took it with relief to the boy, whom she left alone for this time. Turning around, she saw the boy still standing in the same place and thought with relief. He hadn't run away. Seeing how his gaze brightened when he looked at the freshly baked bread, the girl understood. Good. He was interested in food. She picked up 1 loaf of bread and put it to her mouth to show the child how to eat it properly and said, "So." Then she handed him a whole loaf of bread and finished her sentence. They eat. Having received the warm bun in his hands, the boy simply looked at it with interest for some time. Then, following the girl's instructions, he bit into the treat. Noticing this, Reinhart said happily, "That's right. You're a good boy." The child quickly finished the first loaf, so the girl gave him the second one. "Here, have another one." The boy took the second treat, and the former princess asked affectionately, "Delicious." The boy couldn't answer, so he just raised his grateful gaze to Reinhart. A blush appeared on his cheeks. Noticing this, the girl smiled contentedly. A mixture of joy and kindness splashed in her gaze. Running her hand through someone else's dark shock, the girl said with trepidation, "Good boy, you're doing well. This is bread." She pulled back and repeated it again, so the boy would remember. Bread. Yes, bread. Looking at the castle, she promised, "If you come into the castle with me, I will give you more bread." Leaning closer to the child, who was surprised by her words, she continued, "Therefore, come with me." The boy, although he looked scared, did not run away as before. He simply looked at the calm Reinhart with incomprehension. He looked down and, as always, remained silent, pondering someone else's proposal. However, having given in, he gave his hand into the girl's palm, allowing himself to be led inside. The girl said, "That's right," and they both headed inside the cold city to which the former princess had been exiled. An elderly woman met them at the estate. "You probably can't believe it, but I am the lord of this place. My name is Sarah." She continued, "I was responsible for the administration of Ruzhin in the Felden family for a long time." The girl listened with caution to the story of the said lord. The lord personally went to Rudin for the first time in 20 years. To this, Reinhart asked only one rhetorical question with particular displeasure. "That's how it is." And she thought, a mess. Helka and Rudin had fundamental differences. Lord Helka's castle was 10 times larger. However, Lord Rudin's castle looks like it's 300 years old. Cracked, it didn't call to anything lofty. Besides, it snows 6 months a year, and there is a constant shortage of food. There are only 30 soldiers to defend the lands. The girl smiled bitterly and thought logically, "Exactly, there will be no wars with other lands. Who will invade this territory? An image of her mother appeared in her thoughts. My mother's lineage is Fielden. I could never have imagined in my dreams that the lands were in such a state. Turning to Sarah, Reinhart demanded, I want to see my cousins, the previous lords, working records. The woman answered sternly. The previous lord grew up in the large city of Belkane, so he did the work through a deputy. Hearing this, the girl understood. In other words, she doesn't want any lord who is not local to interfere, but the girl understood that she couldn't do that. Michel, that son of a bitch is still alive. I haven't really started taking revenge yet. The girl turned to Sarah boldly. The crown princess who was driven out of the capital must be too much of a troublesome lord for you. However, the woman immediately began to justify herself. I didn't mean it. But Reinhart stopped her. Here's how. And she ordered. In that case, give me advice on how to conduct business from now on. I will definitely revive these lands. The woman pursed her lips and answered with restraint. I will help as much as I can. Then I want to ask you something. The girl turned to Sarah. They answered her. Speak, and she said, It's about the child. Hearing this, the woman pursed her lips and stared tensely at the floor. When she looked at the child, she remained silent. The boy, hiding behind her back, carefully peered out from behind her hand, and the girl said, He saved my life. She added, He looks like an orphan, but tell me if anyone knows about his origin. And she ordered. Coming closer to the child, Lasky's maid said, So come here, let's go to the bathroom. And shouting the usual, No! Reinhart rushed along the maid. The maid recoiled and cried out in displeasure. Kaya! Turning around in shock, she stammered, That boy. But the boy continued running, screaming, No! There was a worried sound from the hall. What's going on? Someone gave the command, Catch up with that child. And others shouted, Yes. Chasing after the child, the maid put her hand in front of her and shouted, That child is there. Baby, come here. The boy continued to run, screaming, No! Ah! Speeding up, the man shouted, Run faster! The girl commanded, Catch him! Watching all this from the side, the girl couldn't hold back her laughter, and she burst out laughing. Ha ha, well, well. Sarah came up behind her and said, Lord. And the girl answered, Yes. Turning around, she asked, Do you want to say something? And Sarah continued, About the origin of that child. The girl clarified, Oh, I see. He has parents. How old is he? What's his name? Sarah hesitated and continued hesitantly. He is descended from the Holland family. The girl's eyes widened in horror and surprise. What she heard plunged the girl into true shock. She thought, Son of the Holland family, fallen due to the barbarian attack. The image of Michel Alanquez's dedication to his faithful servant floated into her mind. Really, Michel Alanquez's mad dog. She remembered the mad look of her ex-husband's faithful dog. This memory made the girl cringe. Will Holland was a man who appeared one day and became a hero of the Alanquez War. The girl knew. It was known that he was related by blood to the barbarians, but I know his true origin. Vil Halana was the emperor's bastard, who had to hide for a long time. 17 years ago, at the time when the emperor went to inspect the northern lands, an unknown lady of the House of Holland, a small aristocratic family from the north, she became pregnant. The empress, having learned about this, was angry. She screamed. A provincial noblewoman dared to bear the emperor's child. Consumed by a violent rage, she ordered, to burn out the entire Holland family and make sure that no one remained alive. As a result, the Holland family, falsely accused of treason, was destroyed. Everyone believed that Villa Holland was dead. However, in the year that Michel Alanquez turned 34, in the year that 10 years had passed since our divorce, Michel Alanquez brought him to power, Villa Halonu, making him his personal dog. He fought like he would die if he didn't kill anyone. He won on every battlefield. All these achievements are the merits of his owner. Michel Alanquez, Michel Alanquez, Michel Alanquez. The insufferable Crown Prince Michel Alanquez was eventually enthroned as the beloved emperor. Behind the bright side of the great Emperor Michel Alanquez, there was always a shadow in front of Will Holland. Will Holland, that damned man! The girl counted. I was sure I would succeed in the rebellion. Yes. However, she thought, until the moment she met Helk, who came to the lands where war was being prepared. Villa Holland, as if waiting for this moment. The stately shadow guarding Michel was indeed a problem for the girl. The girl understood. Despite the fact that I had Helka's huge army and a river of wealth, I wasn't sure that I could resist no matter what. This man. Sitting tensely opposite each other, they understood how different they were. Will Holland. There was steel in his gaze, so the hope that the girl would be able to resist him quickly faded. The girl wiped the wet, thick shock of someone else's unruly hair with a white cloth towel, while its owner grimaced. Emerging from her thoughts, the girl looked at the nameless child in surprise. Smiling with relief, the girl said tenderly, "So you're handsome." The boy's cheeks became rosy again. Dressed in clean clothes and washed in warm water, the child became even cuter. The three Gorchnans standing behind them stared at the painting. "Sorry, lady, we can't help. Move on. He won't let anyone touch the stove, only me. I had no choice but to take care of it myself. Go ahead." "Yes, lady." Looking down again at the child's innocent face, the girl thought, Will Holland. Will Holland. It flashed through her mind again, and her hands began to tremble involuntarily. Clenching them into a fist, the girl tried to calm herself down and move away from thoughts about Villa. Smiling tensely, she said, "We're done with washing. Go to the dining room and ask for bread." Hearing the familiar word, the now clean boy quickly perked up and, jumping up from his chair, turned enthusiastically to the girl. Afterwards, he quickly ran out of the spacious room, shouting joyfully, "Bread." Having seen off the running boy with a gentle smile, the girl waited until he disappeared around the corner. As soon as the child disappeared, she slowly sank down on the door, pure alarm appearing in her eyes. And she loudly closed the door so that no one would notice her unstable state. Stepping away from the door, the girl covered her mouth with her hand in panic and thought, if this child is really Will Holland. Covering her face with her hands, she let bitter tears splash onto her palms. They ran between her fingers and remained as drops on her clothes. A smug image of her now ex-husband flashed into her head. Taking her hands away from her teary eyes, the girl thought, to take revenge. She turned to her father in her thoughts. "Father, you knew. You gave me a new life to give to Will Holland." Her hands involuntarily folded into a half-prayerful rigidity, her tear-stained gaze fixed in front of her. This was only the beginning. There was an unexpected knock at the door, so I nervously wiped away the remnants of salty tears with the back of my hand. "Come in!" A puzzled boy's head appeared from behind the massive door. "So it was you." The boy ran closer and said, "Bread. Give it to me, and in this life, Will Holland will be by my side." The boy handed the loaf of bread into the girl's hands. "Thank you. You are next to me. You will grow up listening to me." A satisfied smile blossomed on the former princess's face. She said, "Thank you, Will, really." Hearing the unfamiliar word, the boy stared at the girl in confusion and answered, "No." And she thought, "You will become a knight." Smiling even wider, the girl calmly named the now nameless boy. "From now on, your name is Wilhelm." She again lowered her hand into the stranger's shock of unruly hair and, ruffling it, said contentedly, "Wilhelm will do." The girl braided the hair of a young man, also thinking, "This little child is 16. A woman came up to her and said, 'Sorry, I can't help you again. Is it your fault that he's afraid of people?' The girl with long golden hair asked, "More importantly, do they give out food and things to the residents on Thanksgiving?" The woman answered, "Yes. Winter in Ruden is merciless. If the Lord does not distribute food, the inhabitants will die of hunger." The girl spread the papers out in front of her and began to mumble, "Salt, flour, dried beans. Flour is too expensive." The girl looked up and said, "Growing corn is possible here too. Can we make flour from it and distribute it?" The old woman replied indifferently, "A good idea, but we don't have enough workers to do the job." She asked, "In what lands can you not find even 100 soldiers?" The woman answered, "If you count all the young men, there won't be even 100. She kept saying, "In the capital, on Thanksgiving, they eat a fat turkey." The blonde interrupted, "It's impossible to find her here." The old lady kept saying, "True. Anyway, the captain of the garrison went goose hunting, so you'll have some goose." Rain asked, "Is anyone coming to dinner?" She answered, "The Lord has not visited Ruden all this time." The girl said, "She is free," and then the door slammed shut, leaving the blonde with yellow eyes frozen in thought. The girl squinted, imagining herself in the winter mountains. She thought, sighing heavily, "These are disgusting lands." Rein thought, "They are different from the Helka I got in my past life. There were 3,000 soldiers there." The girl picked up the piece of paper and read it. This year, the guards were given 1 bag of dried apples as a reward. The girl cursed under her breath, remembering her old life. Hearing this, the attentive child immediately turned around. She pressed her fist to her lips, then looked down, as if contemplating something inevitable. Then she turned away and exhaled heavily, saying, "A rusty Wilhelm. I didn't say this to you at all." The blonde leaned over, slowly rubbing her forehead, and said, "I decided not to swear in front of you, but sometimes it slips out." The girl hastened to apologize again, but Wilhelm could only answer, "No." He blushed and opened his eyes wide. Then the girl turned her gaze to the dying logs in the fireplace and said, "Okay, let's see if you've done the task." There were only a few words written on the piece of paper. Cornmeal, soldiers, turkey. Again, you were thinking about something else. The girl sat the guy on her knee and said, "This is from our conversation with Sarah. Should I appoint you as a secretary?" The girl stroked the boy's head, which made him even more embarrassed. She said, "Either way, you're doing well. It is difficult to find a teacher for Wilhelm in Ruden, mainly because there are few qualified people in Ruden, but it was also because new rumors had started to spread. She heard them behind her back when she went out. The rumor went like this. The new lord went mad after losing her father. As a result, he was exiled for attacking the crown prince. The girl sighed heavily and thought, "So I'll have to teach him myself. What else can I do?" She raised her nose higher. The girl thought, "Fortunately, the child is smart, but there are shortcomings. Like that day when it just started snowing outside. A soldier flew down, throwing his sword that had fallen from his hands onto the hard ground. A loud male scream was heard. A certain youth stood before him. It was Wilhelm, who held a strong steel sword in his hands. Behind him was Rain. The guy with the black eyes looked stern and distrustful, as if he was cornered. She turned around. Then the boy with long hair threw down his sword himself, of his own free will, because he had already managed to defeat his opponent. The boy screamed as he ran closer to the stunned blonde. "No!" The little child threw himself into her arms. The boy's cheeks were always red. Wilhelm himself looked happily at the girl who kept saying, "You're great." The girl thought, "There is no one who could teach him fencing. At least I cannot teach him this." The girl clenched her jaw again and frowned her bright yellow eyes, thinking. Michel quickly found him a teacher. The blonde remembered. He knew that Wilhelm was the emperor's bastard, because I got the information from his confidant. Rien didn't understand. How did Michel know about Wilhelm's origin? If even that idiot understood, the method is simple. Then the girl noticed how the little boy was writing. Then she noticed a ring on his hand. The blonde opened her yellow eyes wide in surprise, he thought. Could this ring really belong to the imperial family? The girl closed her eyes and exhaled heavily, trying to comprehend all this. She thought, what kind of stupid thoughts are these? But she was pulled out of her train of thought by that same young man with long black hair. He showed her a piece of paper right in her face. The guy finally said, "The girl did not open her eyes from the childish handwriting on her wife's paper. You've already done everything." The girl reached out her hand to the young man, then said, "Well done." She narrowed her eyes slightly again and smiled. The boy then opened his eyes and opened his mouth in surprise. He finally decided to say, "No." Wilhelm looked surprised. The girl opened her eyes wide in surprise, then wanted to ask such a young and taciturn boy again. Then the young man put his palm to her cheek. The blonde froze in place in surprise at the actions of this kid. Then the young man pressed his head to her neck, hugging the girl. Then the blonde was even more surprised, watching the guy. But after a few moments, the boy immediately recoiled from the girl with bright yellow eyes who was watching. Wilhelm blushed and lowered his black eyes to the floor, avoiding the girl. "What did you just do?" But the girl couldn't wait for an answer, because the long-haired brunette ran out of the room, leaving the door open. The girl was still sitting on the chair, and only turned around in surprise, not taking her eyes off the running, embarrassed boy. Meanwhile, the weather outside was raging. Winter had already arrived, so frost was visible on the trees, and snow was falling from the sky. The girl laughed kindly, also put her hand to her mouth and said, "He does such cute things." And then the morning of Thanksgiving came. The snow did not stop falling. The girl thought, "They say that a smile attracts luck?" The girl jumped up from her seat, tearing herself away from the stack of documents. She smiled happily and screamed, "Dietrich!" And then, one knee dropped to the cold floor. It landed with a thud in front of the blonde, also greeting her. The man almost screamed, opening his mouth wide. "Your Highness!" The man's voice immediately echoed off the walls of the room. It was a man with chestnut hair and bright green eyes. He smiled and asked, "Are you in good health?" The man knelt before the blonde, continuing to look kindly at the young girl in front of him. She jumped up to him with tears in her eyes and said, "What is this?" Dietrich replied, "Sorry, I found out too late. Then the man began to rise from the floor, saying, "Hearing that you had left the capital alone, I immediately set out." The girl pressed her lips together, trying to stop the tears. She swallowed the lump in her throat. Her pupils began to tremble slightly. The girl said to Dietrich, "No, don't say that." And then Wilhelm paid attention to their conversation, deciding to eavesdrop. Rein kept saying, "I'm grateful just for coming." The guy bowed his head, also blushed slightly, and then the man said, addressing Her Highness, "We are in close relations with you." The boy opened his eyes even wider. "Dietrich Ernst is a childhood friend with whom we used to have fun." The girl thought, remembering the past. Dietrich is also one of the knights that father trusted the most. Raina knew this. Ernst always followed her. "Dietrich was my fleeting first love," the girl recalled. "I didn't expect it to be so cold in the northeast." The man wiped away a tear and said, "I passed the last mountain, wandering in search of you, which could be covered with snow." The girl sat down at the table again and said, "And I am no longer your highness. What should I call you then?" The girl smiled mockingly and also frowned, saying, "Before my marriage you called me milady." Dietrich leaned closer to her and asked, "You even have a title now. Should I call you Viscountess?" "Call me whatever you want." Dietrich said, "Well, it's better here than I thought. I was worried. The lands are exhausted. Compared to the lands of Helka, these are the events of the previous life." She remembered, saying, more precisely, she was surprised to find herself here after the life of the crown princess. The guy asked the blonde, "What are you going to do in the future?" The girl wanted to answer something, but seemed to change her mind. Suddenly the girl with yellow eyes asked, "Why are you interested?" The man froze in place, awkwardly looking at the floor. Then the man scratched his neck and said, looking away from the girl, "Sorry, I crossed the line." The blonde said, turning to Dietrich, "No, well, if you have ideas, say it." The man hesitated altogether, and then the man finally said, "It's a pity the crown prince lost you, Viscountess." The girl was only slightly surprised. Then Dietrich turned away from the blonde, and an awkward silence fell between them, which no one was in a hurry to break. If Dietrich had shown up a year ago, I would have thought he would have asked how I was feeling. But he came to me. Now that the crown prince has not recovered from the shock of his wound, all the lords of the empire are groveling before the emperor. She thought, that he came alone to Ruden at such a time. The girl thought and smiled slightly, then said, "Dietrich Ernst." The man crossed his arms over his chest and opened his eyes wide when he heard the girl's question. "You were expelled from the clan, or did you leave yourself?" Dietrich smiled and said, "If I had to choose between the two, it would be the latter." She replied, "You said you were leaving your family." In response, Dietrich nodded his head, and then he finally became more serious. The smile disappeared from his lips. The man said, "I am concerned that Michel Alanquez is trying to take over the lands of Rinka completely, abandoning the marquisate." Dietrich kept saying, "Viscountess, you just became a criminal, and he is trying to seize all the property of the Rinka world state." He said, "Not only lands, but also knights. The main wealth of the marquisate are the knights who now serve another." The man smiled brightly and said, "I couldn't watch as a person who can't even walk properly." And then the girl looked at Dietrich. For some reason, the atmosphere between the two friends changed dramatically, became more gloomy, but it passed almost immediately, because Dietrich blushed, looking at the blonde, who smiled, shaking her head. The girl laughed, saying, "Sir Ernst would probably have given me a severe reprimand. He came to swear allegiance to me. Sorry, but here the knights are given star anise as a New Year's gift." And the guy asked, "What is star anise?" She answered, "It's added to tea." The guy said, "I don't like tea, it's okay, but you have no business here." "Well, it looks like that." "I noticed it too when I entered Ruden Castle," Dietrich said. "There won't even be 50 soldiers." The girl read from the paper in surprise. 30 people. The man with green eyes asked in surprise, "Seriously?" The girl looked sternly and answered, "Seriously." And then Ernst turned away from the blonde and said tiredly, "Damn, then Dietrich Ernst will have to play the role of leader." The girl with yellow eyes looked down at the floor, as if she didn't know what to say to such an optimistic young man, she thought, watching his silhouette recede, moving further away. Dietrich? Does he really have to rot here doing nothing? After a while, swords were flying onto the training ground. The training was quite active, despite the snowfall. A young boy named Wilhelm defeated his opponent, holding an iron sword tightly in his hands. The girl stood behind. The child looked sternly at his opponent, whom he had easily defeated. The girl was tense about something. She suddenly turned to Dietrich, saying, How about adding the role of fencing teacher to the role of the main character? He stopped and asked again with displeasure. Are you telling me to teach little children? The girl justified herself. It is not so. She smiled happily, saying, Have you seen the child who was sitting here recently? He should be in the dining room now. Then the man smiled mockingly and bowed his head, answering my lady. I will have to receive more than one bag. She ran up, saying, A sack of wheat and a goose for dinner tonight. You didn't intend to give me this in the first place? She replied. If you don't want it, starve. I have no dinner for an uninvited guest. He replied mockingly, You're overdoing it. It was already approaching sunset, because the sky was gradually turning orange and pink, and snow was falling on the roofs of the houses. A certain man, with a ring on his finger, was holding a small spoon tightly in his hands, sitting at the kitchen table. It was Wilhelm, who was preparing for the meal, and with wide eyes he watched the people. He was here. The blonde held Dietrich's hand, still smiling. She turned to the boy. Say hello, Wilhelm, the girl finally said. It was him, Dietrich. Then the man immediately turned his attention to the brunette, squinting his eyes with distrust. Wilhelm became frightened by such a close gaze and opened his mouth wide, trying to move away from the place of the meal. A voice sounded above the people's heads, wanting to tell them some news. A tense atmosphere hung in the air. The blonde sat down at the chair. Dietrich put his hand on its back, asking, What kind of child is this? He saved my life. The blonde turned around and said to her knight, Treat him well, befriend him, sit next to him. Dietrich came closer to the child and greeted him joyfully, smiling brightly. But the child only shrank even more. And then, just a moment later, the young man jumped up from his seat, pushing away from himself a bowl of fresh soup. Wilhelm then ran out of the room, leaving the two people in disbelief. Dietrich froze in place. Then the boy just stuck his head out from behind the door, looking sternly at Dietrich, who just wanted to make friends. The girl looked sternly at the boy and called him again. Her voice became more stern and cold. Dietrich also stopped smiling warmly. He only looked sternly at the little boy who was hiding behind the door. The girl smiled awkwardly and said, turning to the boy, Wilhelm, you need to eat. Good boy, come here quickly. The man just looked indifferently at the blonde, who was already twitching, saying, What? She blushed in bewilderment. Then the man rested his chin on his hand and asked my lady, smiling slightly, Should I bring him? The girl turned around and whispered to the boy, No. Wilhelm is a child who has experienced violence, he is afraid. The blonde said, Leave it to me. The guy turned away and asked in bewilderment, What are you going to do? And then a loud chomping sound was heard. Hearing it, the knight even flinched, opening his eyes wide in surprise. The girl began to eat the meat quickly, speaking very loudly. Delicious. How delicious? The man asked fearfully. Viscountess? The girl continued to harden. There was so much juicy meat, like oil dripping down. She began to eat, demonstratively showing it. The knight asked awkwardly, in a whisper, What are you doing? Trust me, it's easier to interest a child who's acting up at the table. The boy looked out from behind the door again, his eyes wide. But then, after a few moments, he frowned. The girl asked, Still not enough? The knight replied, Anyone looking will think that you have experience in raising children. Dietrich jumped up from his place, took the plate of butter in his hands, saying, I'll help, the girl said. But then a certain sound was heard, and both acquaintances immediately turned their heads towards the front door. Their eyes widened. A boy named Wilhelm ran away from them, clenching his fists tightly. He stamped his feet very loudly. The two boys froze in place, not knowing what to do. Their eyes widened even more. The boy froze in place. He asked, Should I bring him? The girl answered, Let's move on. If he gets hungry, he'll come to his senses. Let's eat. But then, after some time, the girl turned to Wilhelm again. It was already daytime, because the sun was shining outside the window. Dietrich and the girl over the boy's bed. The blonde kept saying, It's been 3 days since you left the room, she said. You've been skipping all your meals during this time. Why are you acting like this? No. The girl got angry, cried out discontentedly. What do you mean, no? Get out right now! The knight looked sternly. The girl turned to Dietrich and asked, What should you threaten a child of that age with? He asked. How old is he? The blonde answered immediately, 16. The man was shocked, and he cursed loudly, then asked again. The girl asked discontentedly, Did you just curse at your mistress? The guy almost fell to his knees. Nothing like that. Wilhelm just stuck his head out, listening to the knight's voice. I was just surprised that he was 16. He was too small. The man tilted his head and answered thoughtfully. There are small and fragile teenagers everywhere. The girl asked, then why? He commits more primitive acts than a newborn child. Then the man opened his eyes and muttered. And this man was already even 16. And then the boy again hid completely under the blanket, avoiding the gaze of the strangers who were watching him. Dietrich smiled brightly as he said, When I was 16, I went to war following Rinka and served him. The girl looked down, also blushing, saying, Yes, that's how it was. You were my father's escort. And then the man exhaled heavily, saying, Yes, Viscountess, you think that since he's the size of a kitten. He's a little child who needs to be hugged and coddled. Leave that to me. And then the man jumped closer to Wilhelm's blanket, quickly grabbing it. Dietrich Ernst grabbed the boy's leg, which he managed to get out from under the blanket. The young man tried to resist. He opened his black eyes wide and beads of sweat rolled down his face. Dietrich lifted him up by his leg, leaving the boy standing only on his elbows. The man said irritably, his green eyes flashing, Your name is Wilhelm, then. That's what the Viscountess called you, right? The man continued to insist. If you behave like this, you will never become a man capable of living up to this name in your entire life. And then he abruptly lowered the boy, causing the young brunette to roll across the bed, losing his support. The girl turned to her knight with displeasure, who kept saying, They said you're 16? Then Dietrich Ernst smiled brightly and mockingly, freezing for a moment in one place, next to the bed. He pointed to his chest, then said boastfully, At 18, Reinhart proposed to me. The girl started hitting him on the head, screaming, What are you saying? He replied, Well, it's true. There was a silence between them, and then the two acquaintances turned their attention to Wilhelm, who was still in front of them. Now the boy sat quietly in front of two people who looked at the little boy with disapproval. He looked down, but raising his head higher, he looked at the knight with a stern look. He frowned very deeply. Dietrich said, crossing his arms over his chest, Judging by your actions, you know how to use your head. I realized that right away. The knight continued to repeat, And even though you look like a child, boys at 16 are treacherous. When you're 18, are you going to hide and just watch too? Wilhelm was hurt by these words. He narrowed his black eyes again, watching the knight in front of him with condemnation and contempt. And then the boy answered, No. In response, the man smiled mockingly, saying, Look at his gaze. The man extended his hand forward, saying, Look with respect. After all, this is the beginning of the lesson. The knight smiled brightly again. Little Reinhart climbed the tree, but someone said, Come down, she answered. Johanna said she would make jam. The girl continued to tweed. The apricots were perfectly positioned, and it was true, because the fruit was hanging on the tree. But then, just a moment later, the girl's foot slipped from the branch, and she let out a frightened gasp as she fell down. But when she screamed, she immediately landed in a man's arms. It was her knight, Dietrich Ernst. The girl looked at the boy in surprise, her bright yellow eyes wide open. Her hair seemed to be flying in the air. Then the boy sighed heavily, trying to catch his breath from fear for such a fragile and young milady. He looked tired. But just a moment later, the boy smiled brightly, his green eyes sparkling as he asked, Are you okay? The girl froze in place, as if she was unable to even move. She only looked at the guy's face with admiration. She thought back to that moment. Yes, there had definitely been a time like that. But now she was walking through the castle, screaming his name. The girl ran after the knight, who held Wilhelm by the scruff of the neck and spoke. Men have their own way of communicating, she said. What are you saying, grabbing the child? Dietrich asked. Then should I let him go and return to Ernst? The girl froze in place from such harsh words, looking fearfully at Dietrich in front of her. She narrowed her eyes slightly. They both froze in place. Only Wilhelm was still trying to resist and break free from the man's hands. The blonde began to feel even more awkward, clutching the blue hem of her dress even tighter. A strange atmosphere hung in the air. Then the girl blushed and looked away with her yellow eyes, saying, I'm sorry, Wilhelm. The girl came closer to the boy and stroked his head, saying, But Dietrich will really be a good teacher. The girl kissed the young boy on the forehead, saying, Listen to him and become a wonderful person. The boy froze in place, his black eyes wide open. He blushed even more, watching the actions of Milady. Maybe you'll appreciate the teacher, not the student, she replied. You're amazing. Getting a compliment while being poked in the side isn't bad either. The girl smiled mockingly and said, How frivolous you are. Treat Wilhelm well. Then the man took her hand and said, Yes, certainly, Viscountess. She gently placed her hand in his palm. Then the knight kissed her hand, saying, As you command. The girl smiled softly, watching the knight's actions. Watching this, the young man behind was clearly dissatisfied, so he opened his black eyes wide, watching them. He noticed the knight bending over Milady and almost cried out in anger. It was visible how his face had dimmed. And then the knight turned around, still smiling happily. He narrowed his eyes slightly and looked pleased. Noticing this, the man laughed loudly, leaving the girl behind in bewilderment. She looked at him. The girl asked, "Why are you laughing?" The guy took Wilhelm by the side and answered, "Nothing. I'll go on where I was going." Meanwhile, in Ruden, there was still quite a heavy snowfall, but no one even thought of canceling training because of this. Wilhelm fell to the ground, throwing his sword away. The knight said firmly, "Listen carefully. I'm not going to repeat myself." The man bowed his head and said sternly to the 16-year-old boy, "I don't like children who can't think straight." The man towered over Wilhelm and continued to say, "The Viscountess may have kissed such a child, but I will not." The man moved closer to the child, who tried to flinch. "Do you know what I did next to Reinhart every day?" And then the man said, without taking his stern gaze away, "I drove the bastards from the lands with the same gaze as yours." Wilhelm looked sternly at the man, as if he saw before him not his teacher, but an enemy. "He understands me." Then the knight turned away and said, "I heard that you saved the Viscountess's life, a child who can't even speak." And then the man clenched his jaw even tighter, causing his lips to resemble one thin line. But then the man said, his eyes wide, "Consider it an honor that someone like you could save the Viscountess's life." Dietrich kept saying, "I will make you worthy of this honor. After all, the Viscountess wants it." The child's gaze did not change. Then a man threw a wooden sword up into the air. It was Dietrich who threw Wilhelm's weapon, saying, "Get up." The boy looked at his new weapon in surprise, his mouth wide open. The knight said, "Quickly, quickly, move." The boy only clenched his jaw and bared his teeth in response, as if he could no longer contain all that anger. The boy gripped the sword's hilt tightly. He didn't even tremble, despite the fact that he was wearing a light jacket during a snowfall. The boy was breathing heavily, but his gaze was determined. It was clear that he was truly ready for a fight. The knight calmly watched Wilhelm's behavior, towering over the boy, and remembered, "Well, I did come to Ruden after all." The man with green eyes remembered, "I did it in hopes of persuading Reinhart to leave these damn cold lands." But now the knight understands. But be that as it may, the day is far off when we will abandon the empire. Then he said, "Attack, bastard!" Several weeks later, the snowfall was still ongoing, as were the training sessions. Dietrich did not feel sorry for the youngster at all. There were other soldiers standing next to the man, who spoke in admiration. "You are incredible! To cut off a pig's neck so neatly!" The soldier kept saying, "This is the first time I've seen a knight like you." Dietrich replied happily, "This is the first time I've been praised like this." Then, smiling even more brightly, he said, "Well, that's better than being praised for being good at chopping off human necks." Reinhart watched from the window, muttering, "His ability to connect with others is astounding. People avoid the Lord." But suddenly, a certain person addressed Reinhart, and the blonde immediately turned around, her eyes wide open. And then she opened her yellow eyes even wider, and her mouth with them. She was very surprised. In front of her stood Wilhelm, who was clearly embarrassed by his appearance. He had cropped hair and was dressed like a knight. Reinhart laughed loudly, asking, "Wilhelm, what's wrong with your hair?" The boy answered awkwardly, "Dietrich." The girl laughed loudly again and asked, "Did Dietrich cut your hair? It looks like a rat gnawed it." She couldn't stop laughing. The boy blushed with shame and also could not utter a word, looking away to the side, away from the blonde. But then the girl called him into a certain room, telling him to go there. She opened a rather large wooden door. The girl sat him down on a chair, then took hold of the boy's head. She said tenderly, "I'll trim it." The knight joyfully repeated, "He is 16. He can neither speak nor swing a sword. He must be beaten like a mouse." "Does that make sense?" Reinhart asked, thinking, dissatisfied. "Then I thought it was just an excuse," she thought. But Wilhelm actually started talking more. Much more than when I taught him. "Is that strange?" The blonde answered, holding him by the shoulders. "No, it's not weird, it's cute. Cute, but there are still some nuances." The girl smiled happily again and said to Wilhelm, "If you trim it a little, it will be even cuter." She took a pair of large scissors in her hands and said, "Good boy, sit still." The boy blushed and also froze. Then the boy's hair fell to the floor in huge locks, she thought. It will still be better than Dietrich's. As a result, almost all of the child's hair was cut off, leaving him with only very short strands that barely covered his forehead. Dietrich laughed when he saw this. What? He joined the military? What's wrong? He still can't stop saying no? The blonde was ashamed and said, Dietrich, she thought. Is this strange? The man answered. I understand. But then the knight struck the young boy's forehead with his index finger. He frowned and closed his eyes. Then the man smiled even brighter, saying, It's good that your forehead is clearly visible, bastard. Wilhelm tried to cover it. The man began to pull the young boy's hair, and he tried to resist. Reinhart exclaimed, Stop torturing the child. But then it was time for the meal. The guy looked in surprise at the soup in front of him, which was served to him by a certain girl. I assumed, but the menu is varied. There were potatoes and corn soup on the table. In winter, even such food is a holiday. The knight said, Who do you take for a capricious child if you say so? Even a child does not act capriciously.